Okay, so what I aspire to do is to help companies navigate complex systems and catalyze desirable futures. So the tools that I'm using are kind of fit around that. So I'll start with saying that there's some tools that are about sensing or sense making and navigating or wayfinding. So two that I'll mention, and I think many of these tools will be very familiar to people. You know, there are lots of experts here. So yeah, so I'm kind of speaking to the converted in many ways, but systems practice. So participatory systems mapping, you know, identifying dynamics in a system, forces, enablers, barriers, and how they're connected. And then with the goal of also finding leverage points. You know, I spoke earlier about those acupuncture points. Yeah, so I think that's kind of a classical systems thinking tool. I think some people that I also worked with on that are in the course of Renee Rowan, I think was in one of the meetings. So we looked at, for instance, the tech innovation ecosystem in Cape Town, Nairobi, and Lagos. So yes, so that's one example. The other thing is, so understanding, that system, those dynamics, but also understanding the stakeholder landscape that we find ourselves in. So, you know, who's who in a certain space, what are the relationships between them? And there one can use, you know, participatory stakeholder mapping. There are lots of tools there. I mean, one of the very common ones, there's that influence importance matrix. But then a tool that I am very interested in is network analysis. Now, I realize we have limited time, so I'm very passionate about this, and I can talk for too long, and I won't. But, you know, I just think that there are many things in many systems that are organized in relational networks. So yes, human systems, but also in nature, in technical systems. And I do think there's quite a lot of explanatory potential in some of, that one can find by doing some network analysis. You know, you can identify key stakeholders or influences. That's kind of an obvious one. You can model how information or energy flows in a system. You can look at things like network effects or contagion or how things go viral, you know, viruses in the different kinds. You can also look at things like how networks and network structure influences resilience. So that's something that, like a pet project of mine at the moment, that I'm thinking about. But yes, so I think that's key. I think there's also something around understanding and doing the work of networks, because who was it Andrew that mentioned, or, you know, sometimes there are lots of initiatives. I mean, you said to get things off the ground. What I'm thinking around is also around your system of systems idea. You know, how do you weave together? Sometimes it's not just about just disrupting or starting something new. It's actually to speak to others who are already doing things in the system. Anyway, okay, let me stop on the networks thing. Very interested in that, so happy to talk more afterwards. And then the last thing, so those maps are kind of like sense-making maps. They're navigation tools, but also this idea of catalyzing desirable futures. You know, how can you nudge systems towards a more desirable state? How do you deal with the not yet? How do you deal with, and then, I mean, people who work in this space speak about futures, so it's always in plural, because the idea is there are different options there. You know, how do we, all these questions, how do you remain responsive to a complex and changing environment? Now, you know, there are people here, you know, Tanya and Chantal and Deirdre and others are here who work a lot in this space. So, but I'll just mention a couple of tools that I also think are pretty useful. And I've done some of this work actually with Tanya. So Tanya is, does a lot of this work. I saw like a discussion around Three Horizons there in the chat box. So yes, so I mean, horizon scanning for me is one. There are different tools to do horizon scanning, but it's really the idea of not just looking at what we know or kind of looking behind us, but looking ahead. How do we anticipate things that are coming? How do we have practice our peripheral vision? Specific tools around that. I think Three Horizons is one that really lends itself to that, and also has like a inbuilt systems kind of perspective. Something else, causal layered analysis, which Tanya has also, and I've been in a session that she's also facilitated around that, but again has like a built-in kind of way systems perspective there. This is a way to look not just ahead and to the side, but to dig deeper and say, what happens below the headline? And someone asked about that, like root causes, and doing that tool, using that tool, you actually go down and down all the way to kind of the level of myth and metaphor. So I think there are lots of tools in this kind of foresight space. You can look at, instead of forecasting, you can look at backcasting, like looking at where you want to be and then like working backwards. So some of these are the things. I'm just like throwing some things out there, but as I mentioned initially, I'm a firm believer that we cannot make sense of these complex things as individuals or by ourselves, and we cannot change them by ourselves. So, so I think this whole idea of how do we bring groups of people along is really key. So a lot of this work would be participatory. I think I'll leave it there because I can continue, but I think I've covered most of the things I wanted to say.